The scream came first, sharp and sudden, swallowed almost instantly by the wind. Then came the screech of tires skidding across black ice. And after that, a silence that felt heavier than the storm itself. Wesley Holt would remember that silence for the rest of his life, because it was the moment right before a knock on his door changed everything he thought he understood about second chances. What he did not know, as he pulled that door open to a wounded stranger shaking on his porch, was that she carried a secret big enough to undo everything he had built, and maybe, just maybe, everything he was still afraid to want. Before we go any further, if you love stories about ordinary people caught in extraordinary nights, hit subscribe and tap that like button so you never miss a new story here on Winter Vale. Now let's get back to the storm and to the door that was about to open. I have always thought of snow as the world's way of forgiving itself, quietly covering the cracked and broken things until they look whole again. This story is about a man who felt just as cracked as the ice on his windshield, and a woman whose whole life had grown as guarded and cold as a Colorado winter. I hope it reminds you, the way it reminded me, that sometimes the coldest nights are the ones that finally lead us home. Wesley Holt was 36 years old when he quit the only steady job he had ever had. For 9 years, he had worked as a service manager at a dealership outside Denver, tightening bolts and swallowing insults from customers who looked at his coveralls like he was invisible. The dealership was owned, several layers up a corporate ladder he never saw, by a company called Ashbrook Motor Works, and Wesley had spent almost a decade making that company money while his own paycheck barely covered rent and his daughter's asthma medication. The divorce had taken the rest. 2 years of lawyers and courtrooms had drained his savings and most of his patience, and by the time it was over, he had visitation every other weekend in an apartment that echoed too loud when his daughter Grace wasn't in it. He had looked at his life one gray morning, at the version of himself that clocked in and clocked out and never once felt like he was building anything, and he had decided he would rather fail on his own terms than keep succeeding on someone else's. So he packed what little he owned into a truck with a cracked windshield and drove 2 hours into the mountains, to a small town called Elk Ridge where nobody knew his name and nobody expected anything from him at all. He rented a narrow garage on the edge of town, hung a hand-painted sign that read Holt Auto Repair, and told himself that if it failed, at least it would be his failure and not someone else's profit. The first winter nearly broke him. His equipment was secondhand, his tools were borrowed, and for the first 6 weeks, he had exactly 4 customers, all of them curious more than loyal. But Elk Ridge was the kind of town where word traveled slowly and then all at once, and by the time snow came the second year, people had started saying his name the way they said the name of somebody they trusted. He still barely made rent most months, but for the first time since his marriage ended, Wesley felt like a man standing on his own 2 feet. The storm that changed everything rolled in on a Thursday in late January, and it did not announce itself gently. By noon, the sky had turned the color of wet concrete, and by 3 the roads leading into town were sheets of ice hidden under fresh snow. Cars that had started fine that morning refused to turn over by evening, and Wesley's little shop filled with more work in one day than he usually saw in a week. Batteries dead, radiators cracked, one truck that had slid clean into a ditch on Route 9. Snow fell in fat, relentless sheets against the shop windows all afternoon, piling against the bay doors until Wesley had to shovel a path just to keep the entrance clear, and every hour the wind seemed to find a new gap in the old building to whistle through. He worked through dinner and past dark, ignoring the ache climbing up his spine, because 3 more vehicles sat waiting and their owners needed them running before the roads got worse. His hands were black with grease, his knuckles split from the cold metal, and somewhere around 11 o'clock his eyelids finally refused to obey him. Driving home in that weather, exhausted as he was, felt more dangerous than staying put. So he banked the little wood stove in the corner of the shop, pulled an old wool blanket over himself in his father's cracked leather chair, and let the wind outside sing him to sleep. He wasn't sure how long he had been out when the first sound came, a sharp screech of tires somewhere beyond the shop walls, distant and strange, the kind of sound his exhausted brain tried to explain away as nothing at all. He cracked one eye open, saw only darkness and the orange glow of the dying stove, and let himself drift back under before he had even fully surfaced. It was the knock that finally woke him for real, 3 hard, uneven raps against the metal door, followed by nothing. as if whoever stood there no longer had the strength to knock again. Wesley sat up so fast the blanket slid to the floor, his heart hammering before his mind had even caught up to the reason why. He crossed the dark shop in a few long strides, threw the bolt, and pulled the door open into a wall of wind and snow. A woman stood there, maybe somewhere in her 50s, her coat too thin for the weather and dark with what he realized a second later was blood. Her lips were nearly blue, her whole body trembling in violent, uncontrolled waves, and when her eyes finally found his face, all she managed to whisper was, "I had an accident," before her knees buckled beneath her. He caught her before she hit the concrete, one arm sliding around her back, and even through the panic rising in his chest, some old, steady part of him took over, the part that had spent a lifetime fixing things that were broken. He half carried her to the stove, wrapped the blanket around her shaking shoulders, and knelt in front of her, forcing his voice into something calm even though his pulse was roaring in his ears. "You're safe now," he told her. "I've got you. Just breathe. Okay, just breathe with me." His phone had no signal. The storm had likely knocked out a tower somewhere along the ridge, and the shop's landline gave him nothing but a dead, flat hum when he lifted the receiver. The roads outside were sheets of black ice under fresh powder, and his own truck was buried under a drift he hadn't bothered to clear. Getting her to a hospital right now, in this, would be its own kind of gamble, and something in the careful, terrified way she was breathing told him that gamble might be worse than waiting out the worst of the storm. He forced himself to move slower, methodically, the way he approached an engine he didn't fully understand yet. There was a gash above her hairline that had already soaked into her hair, ugly but shallow, and he cleaned it with the trembling steadiness of a man who had bandaged his own knuckles more times than he could count. When he moved to her leg, she let out a short, sharp cry, and one look told him it might be fractured. He found two flat wooden slats from a busted shipping crate, wrapped her leg carefully, and murmured an apology every time she flinched. "I'm not a doctor," he admitted, easing back on his heels once the makeshift splint was tied off, "but I've spent my whole life keeping broken things from getting worse until somebody smarter can fix them properly." She managed something close to a laugh through her chattering teeth, and it was the first sound she had made since her name, which surfaced a few minutes later, soft and unfamiliar in the small, stove-lit shop. "Corinne," she told him, her voice steadier now, just Corinne. He made her tea in a chipped mug because it was the only thing his shop kitchen had to offer, and she wrapped both hands around it like it was the only warm thing left in the world. "Thank you," she said again, her eyes finding his over the rising steam. "Thank you for not just calling this in and waiting for someone else to come." Wesley shrugged, uncomfortable the way he always was with gratitude, and told her honestly that out here, in weather like this, waiting for someone else usually meant waiting too long. He knew he couldn't let her sleep, not with a head wound and a body already shocked from cold. So he kept talking, first about nothing, about the storm in the shop and the stubborn old stove that only worked if you kicked the bottom vent just right. But somewhere in the low, flickering light, the nothing turned into something real, and Wesley found himself telling a total stranger about his divorce, about the years he had spent feeling invisible in a job that used him up and paid him just enough to stay quiet. He told her about Ashbrook Motor Works without any bitterness left to hide, about the dealership that had treated its mechanics like interchangeable parts, about a management culture that rewarded numbers and punished anyone who asked for more than the bare minimum in return. He talked about the night he finally quit, about the terror of driving into these mountains with nothing but a truck full of tools and a stubborn refusal to keep shrinking himself down to fit someone else's spreadsheet. Corinne listened the way almost no one had listened to him in years, without interrupting, without offering advice he hadn't asked for, just steady, quiet attention that made the words come easier instead of harder. When he finally ran out of things to say, feeling faintly embarrassed at how much he'd handed a stranger in one sitting, she looked at him for a long moment and said simply, "You didn't give up, and I don't think you understand how rare that actually is." "Sometimes you don't get a choice," he answered, staring at the stove instead of at her. "Sometimes life just backs you into a corner where you either fight or you disappear." Outside, the wind screamed against the metal walls, but inside the little shop, for reasons neither of them tried too hard to name, the night no longer felt quite so cold. He noticed her eyes drifting again and pulled an old deck of cards from a drawer, more out of desperation than charm, and asked if she knew any good games. All of them, she told him, a faint, tired smile finally breaking through the exhaustion on her face. And for the next hour, they played gin rummy by stove light while the storm slowly, gradually began to loosen its grip on the town outside. When Wesley finally glanced through the frost-crusted window and saw the wind had eased enough to risk the drive, he told her to hang on, that he was going to warm up his truck and come back for her, and made her promise, seriously this time, not to close her eyes. Getting her into the truck meant lifting her, since her leg couldn't bear weight, and he did it as carefully as he had ever done anything in his life, murmuring an apology every time the road jolted her. Snow was still falling in the headlights, thick and slow now instead of sideways and vicious, and Corinne lay quiet in the back seat, too worn down to talk, but calm enough, he thought, to trust that he would get her there. The drive into town felt like it took an hour, though it was closer to 20 careful minutes on roads still slick beneath the tires. The hospital lights hit them both like something from another world after the darkness of the shop, and nurses were moving Corinne onto a gurney almost before Wesley had the truck in park. He stood in the entrance a long moment, snow melting off his shoulders, feeling the strange hollow calm that comes after adrenaline finally lets go of a body. He told himself he could leave now, that his part in this story was over, but some stubborn, unfamiliar instinct kept his boots planted in the waiting room instead of pointed toward the door. A doctor finally emerged near 2 in the morning, a tired-looking man named Dr. Whitaker who studied Wesley with something like curiosity before speaking. "You're the one who brought her in," he said, and when Wesley nodded, the doctor's face relaxed into something more reassuring. "She's going to be fine. The cut on her head needed a few stitches, but nothing serious. And the leg is a clean fracture, not the kind that requires surgery. She'll be in a cast and off it for a few weeks. That's the worst of it." Relief hit Wesley harder than he expected, considering he had known this woman for less than 12 hours, and he was already turning toward the exit doors when a young nurse caught his sleeve. "She's asking for you," the nurse said, and something in her tone made it clear this wasn't a routine request. Wesley followed her down a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and stepped into a room where Corinne sat propped against white pillows, her leg already in a fresh cast, her head neatly bandaged, looking somehow both exhausted and lighter than she had in his shop. "I just wanted to thank you properly," she told him once the nurse had gone, "because out there, in that cold, I don't want to think about what would have happened if you hadn't opened that door." Wesley shook his head, still uncomfortable taking credit for what had felt, in the moment, like simple instinct. Corinne studied him for a beat before speaking again, her voice quieter now, more careful. "There's something about you," she said, like someone who's used to being alone but still can't stop himself from taking care of other people. He didn't have an answer for that, not one he trusted himself to say out loud. So instead he asked if she needed anything before he left. "A ride arranged," family called. She hesitated, then admitted her daughter was staying at a lodge farther up the mountain and had no idea any of this had happened, and that once the roads cleared properly, a hospital coffee wasn't exactly the send-off she wanted for the strangest night of her life. Wesley surprised himself by suggesting they get an actual cup of coffee instead, somewhere warm, once she was cleared to leave, and Corinne's answering smile told him she'd been hoping he would. 3 days later, once the roads were finally scraped clear and Corinne had been discharged with a pair of crutches she clearly resented, they met at a small cafe 2 blocks from the hospital, its windows fogged with warmth against the cold outside. Wesley ordered black coffee out of habit and watched Corinne turn her cup slowly in her hands, like she was working up to something. Finally, she set it down and looked directly at him. "I need to tell you who I actually am," she said, "and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." He nodded, bracing himself for something he couldn't have predicted even if he'd tried. "I own Ashbrook Motor Works," Corinne said, her voice low, watching his face carefully as the words landed. "I'm the majority shareholder, and the dealership you spent 9 years of your life working for was one of mine." Wesley's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. For a long moment he simply stared at her, waiting for some sign this was a joke, and when none came, all he managed to say was, "You're kidding." "I'm not," she said, "and I heard every single thing you said about my company that night, about how it treats the people who actually keep it running." "I could have been offended," she admitted, But instead I spent the whole night in that hospital bed thinking about how right you probably were. Wesley felt heat crawl up his neck, mortified in a way he hadn't been in years, and started apologizing before she cut him off with a raised hand. Don't, she said firmly. I needed to hear it, and I want to do something about it, starting with you. She told him, in the plain, direct way he was already learning was hers, that she wanted to invest in Holt Auto Repair, new equipment, a second bay, maybe eventually a second employee, real capital behind a shop she believed had real potential. Wesley pushed back immediately, some old, proud part of him refusing an offer that felt too much like charity, telling her he'd built this thing with his own two hands and didn't need a stranger's fortune propping it up. Corinne didn't back down. This isn't charity, Wesley, she said, her tone firm. This is a partnership, and partnerships only work when both people bring something real to the table. You already have. It took him 2 more days of sitting with the offer before he called her. And when he finally said yes, something in his own voice surprised him, steadier and lighter than it had sounded in years. Natalie showed up at the shop before the paperwork was even finished, arms crossed, boots crunching across the gravel lot, with the particular wariness of a daughter who had already decided to be unimpressed. My mother mentioned you, she said, not quite a greeting, studying Wesley the way a mechanic studies an engine that sounds fine but might not be. I know what people say when someone my mother's age suddenly finds a new interest, she added, so you'll have to forgive me if I'm not just going to smile and hand you my trust. Wesley set down the wrench he'd been holding and met her eyes without flinching. That's fair, he said, and if it helps, I didn't know who she was until she told me herself in a diner 2 blocks from the hospital. I fixed up a stranger's leg on the worst night of my winter, and it turned out that stranger owns half the cars in Colorado. That's not exactly a plan I could have made even if I'd wanted to. Natalie studied him a moment longer, some of the sharpness easing out of her shoulders, and finally asked if the coffee in the back office was any good, which Wesley understood, correctly, as the beginning of something like peace. By her third visit, she was leaning against his workbench asking real questions about the divorce, about Grace, about why a man would drive 2 hours into the mountains with nothing but a cracked windshield and a stubborn refusal to quit. I haven't seen my mother laugh like that since before my dad got sick, Natalie admitted one afternoon, watching Corinne argue cheerfully with Wesley over the right way to organize a parts shelf. I just need to know you're not going to be the reason she stops laughing again, she said, and Wesley told her, plainly, that he intended to spend a long time proving exactly that. Over the following weeks, Corinne became a regular presence at the shop, first checking on renovations, then simply because she wanted to be there, sharing coffee in the back office long after the actual business had been discussed and settled. Wesley found himself looking forward to the sound of her car in the gravel lot more than he was willing to admit, even to himself. He noticed things he tried hard not to notice, the way she hesitated sometimes before meeting his eyes, the small, private smile she wore when she thought he wasn't looking, the way the space between them at the workbench kept shrinking without either of them deciding it should. One evening, closing the shop after Corinne had lingered longer than any real business required, Wesley finally said what he'd been circling for weeks. I think this stopped being just about the shop a while ago, he told her, and Corinne's answering silence felt like an agreement neither of them was ready to say out loud yet. Snow was falling steadily outside the shop windows the night he finally kissed her, soft and unhurried, catching in her hair when she stepped out afterward into the cold. She pulled back just far enough to search his face, her voice quieter than usual. There's an age difference between us, she said, careful, like she expected it to be a problem he hadn't considered. Wesley shook his head slowly. I know, he admitted, and I've thought about it more than you'd guess, but I keep landing in the same place, that none of it changes how I feel when you walk into a room. What neither of them knew, standing there in the falling snow outside a repair shop that had once been nothing but 4 bare walls and a stubborn man's last chance, was that somewhere back in Denver, a man named Marshall Kessler had already seen a photograph he did not like, and had already begun making calls that would test everything they were just beginning to build. Marshall Kessler had spent 11 years as chief financial officer of Ashbrook Motor Works, and for most of those years he had simply assumed that when Corinne Ashbrook eventually stepped back from the company her late husband built, the reins would land in his hands. He had climbed into the position through family connections rather than merit, had smiled through board meetings while steadily steering contracts toward companies he privately profited from, and had grown very comfortable with the assumption that Corinne, grieving and increasingly withdrawn since her husband's death, would never look closely enough to notice. The photograph came from a company driver who had been sent to collect Corinne from a small mountain town and had, out of habit more than malice, snapped a picture of her laughing with a mechanic outside a modest garage. Marshall studied that photograph for a long time in his glass-walled office, turning it over in his mind the way he turned over a balance sheet, looking for the angle that would let him use it. A woman her age, her position, suddenly infatuated with a divorced mechanic half her social standing, was either a harmless late-life romance or, if he framed it carefully enough, a liability the board could not afford to ignore. He began carefully, the way men like Marshall always begin, mentioning to a board member here, a lawyer there, that he was simply concerned, that Corinne's judgment had seemed unsteady since the accident, that perhaps someone should look more closely at whether she was being taken advantage of during a vulnerable moment. He hired a private investigator under a shell of a consulting contract and had him dig into Wesley's divorce records, his failed first year in business, every unpaid bill and missed payment he could find, building a file meant to look like a pattern rather than the ordinary struggles of an ordinary man starting over. The confrontation came on a gray Tuesday in March, in a boardroom on the 14th floor of the Ashbrook Motor Works headquarters, when Marshall called an emergency session and Corinne walked in already knowing, from the tight, careful faces around the table, that this was not going to be a routine meeting. Marshall stood at the head of the table with a folder in his hands, his voice smooth and reasonable in a way that made Corinne's stomach tighten. "We need to talk about the situation with Mr. Holt," he said, "and about whether your recent decisions have been entirely your own." Corinne kept her spine straight, her voice level, though her pulse had already started to climb. "What exactly are you implying, Marshall?" she asked, and he slid the folder across the polished table without answering directly, letting the photograph speak for him instead. A picture of her and Wesley laughing outside the shop, another from the cafe, a screenshot of the investment transfer he had somehow already obtained. "This isn't about your happiness, Corinne," he said, his tone almost gentle, almost convincing. "It's about whether a man with his financial history should have this kind of access to you and to this company." "He is not after my money," Corinne said, sharper now, her hands flat on the table to keep them from shaking. "And I resent the implication that I am too foolish or too fragile to know the difference between being cared for and being used. He fixed my leg with wood from a shipping crate because the roads were too dangerous to risk a hospital," she added, her voice rising slightly. "That is the man you are trying to turn into some kind of predator, and I would like every person in this room to sit with that for a moment before anyone says another word." Marshall let the silence stretch, clearly enjoying the discomfort rippling around the table, before delivering the line he had clearly been saving. "Perhaps," he said, his tone almost gentle, "the board should consider whether it's time to formally review your capacity to continue making these decisions alone." A few board members exchanged uneasy glances, and one older man near the window cleared his throat as if to speak in her defense. But the fear of aligning against Marshall kept most of the room silent, which was, Corinne realized with a cold, sinking feeling, exactly the outcome he had been counting on. The words landed like a slap, guardianship dressed up in boardroom language, and for one terrible moment Corinne felt the ground genuinely shift beneath her, because she understood exactly how much power a man like Marshall could wield if enough frightened people in that room believed him. It was Corinne's daughter Natalie, sitting still at the far end of the table where she had insisted on being included, who finally spoke into the silence, her voice shaking with anger rather than doubt. "My mother has never once, in my entire life, made a decision without knowing exactly what she was doing," Natalie said, standing, "and I have watched her happier this past month than I have seen her since my father died. And if this board cannot tell the difference between love and manipulation, that says a great deal more about you, Marshall, than it does about her." The meeting adjourned without a vote, Marshall insisting the board simply needed time to review the materials properly, but the damage was already spreading, whispers moving through the company faster than anyone could contain them, a local paper picking up a distorted version of the story within days. Wesley heard about it first from a customer who mentioned it too casually, and by the time he got Corinne on the phone that night, Her voice carried an exhaustion he hadn't heard since the storm that first brought them together. "I'm sorry," she told him. "I never wanted you dragged into this." He wasn't going anywhere, and he told her so. Plainly, standing in his cold garage with the phone pressed to his ear and snow beginning to fall again outside the window, the same soft, steady snow that had started this whole strange chapter of his life. "I've been underestimated my whole life," he said, "by an ex-wife who thought I'd never amount to anything, by a company that used me and never once said thank you. And I am not about to let some accountant with a grudge scare me off now that I've finally found something worth fighting for." The break came 4 days later, when Wesley remembered something he had nearly forgotten in the chaos of that first storm night. That the traffic camera mounted above the intersection near Route 9 recorded everything that passed beneath it, including, he realized with a jolt, the exact moment Curran's car had gone into its skid. He drove into town and requested the footage from the county records office, sitting through an agonizing hour of paperwork before a clerk finally handed him a disc. And what it showed, when he and Curran's lawyer reviewed it together, was exactly the accident she had always described. Ice, a swerve, nothing more sinister than bad weather and worse luck. But the footage revealed something else entirely, something neither of them had expected, because the same camera, running on a loop that stored 2 weeks of recordings, had also captured a car parked suspiciously near that same stretch of road 3 separate times in the month before the accident. Always around the hours Corinne typically drove to visit Natalie. Always the same dark sedan registered, according to the lawyer's quiet, careful research, to a private investigator named Reggie Holbrook, hired under a shell consulting contract that traced straight back to Marshall Kessler. Curran's lawyer arranged a meeting under the pretense of a routine records request, and Wesley insisted on going along, sitting across a cluttered desk from a heavy-set man who would not quite meet his eyes. "We have 4 weeks of your surveillance logs," the lawyer said, sliding a folder across the desk, "along with a license plate that puts your car on Route 9 3 times before an accident you claim to know nothing about. So before we involve the county sheriff, I'd like to know exactly who hired you and why." Holbrook's hands went still on the desk, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, just stared at the folder like it might rearrange itself into something less damning. "I was told it was a simple background check," he finally said, his voice thinner than it had been a minute earlier. "Standard due diligence on a business partner. That's all Marshall told me. I swear I didn't know anything about an accident." Wesley leaned forward, keeping his voice level though his pulse had picked up. "Then explain the parking," he said. 3 separate nights on the exact stretch of road she drives to see her daughter. That's not due diligence, Reggie. That's surveillance. And you're going to want a better answer than the one you just gave me." Holbrook's composure finally cracked, and what followed was not a confession exactly, more a slow, frightened unraveling. An admission that Marshall had paid him in cash outside normal invoices, that he'd been asked to document anything that could be used to suggest Curran's judgment was slipping, and that he had handed over supplementary financial records months ago without ever asking why a CFO needed them kept off the books. Curran's lawyer brought everything to the next board meeting personally, laying out the footage and Holbrook's signed statement alongside financial records that painted an unmistakable pattern. 6 years of supplier contracts quietly steered toward companies owned by Marshall's brother-in-law, embezzled sums dressed up as consulting fees and equipment leases no one had bothered to question closely enough. "It's remarkable," the lawyer said dryly into the stunned silence of the boardroom, "how thoroughly a man can investigate someone else's finances while hoping nobody looks too closely at his own." Marshall's face had gone the color of old paper by the time security walked him out of the building that afternoon, his protests growing thinner and less convincing with every step, while the same board members who had listened to his warnings about Curran's judgment now exchanged the kind of glances that meant a reputation had just ended. Curran watched from the boardroom window as his car pulled out of the parking garage for the last time, and felt something in her chest finally loosen. Not triumph exactly, more like the particular relief of watching a storm finally break somewhere out over the mountains instead of directly overhead. She drove out to Elk Ridge that same evening, her cast finally off, though she still favored the legs slightly on the icy walk from her car to the shop door. Wesley looked up from the engine he'd been buried in and read the whole story on her face before she said a single word, dropping his wrench and crossing the concrete floor in 3 long strides. "It's over," she told him, voice unsteady with the release of weeks of tension. All of it. Marshall's gone. The board apologized. It's actually over. He pulled her into him carefully, mindful of the legs still healing, and held on longer than either of them probably needed, just breathing against the cold night air drifting in through the open bay door. When he finally pulled back enough to look at her, something in his expression had shifted, more serious than she'd seen him in weeks. "I need to say something," he told her, "and I need you to actually hear it before you argue with me the way you argue with everyone." "I almost let Marshall win a fight he never should have gotten to start," Wesley said, "because some part of me kept thinking, deep down, that maybe he had a point, that maybe a man like me really doesn't belong in a life like yours." Corinne opened her mouth to object immediately, but he shook his head, asking her, gently, to let him finish. "I don't think that anymore," he said. "I spent 4 days proving it wrong with a folder full of paperwork, but I need you to know I almost believed it, and I never want to let a voice like that get that loud in my head again, not when it comes to you." Corinne reached up and touched his jaw, snow catching in her hair the same way it had the night he first kissed her outside this same shop. "I don't care what Marshall thinks, or what the board thinks, or what anyone standing outside this exact moment thinks," she told him, her voice steady now, sure in a way it hadn't been through the entire ordeal. "I only care what's true. And what's true is that you make me feel like myself again for the first time since my husband died. And that isn't something I'm willing to walk away from because it doesn't fit someone else's idea of what makes sense." He kissed her then, slow and certain, snow drifting quietly through the open bay door and settling on the concrete floor around them. The same snow that had once carried her, wounded and frightened, to his doorstep on the worst night of her year and somehow turned it into the best one of his. Behind them, the little wood stove that had kept her warm through that first terrifying night still ticked and glowed in the corner, faithful as ever, as if it too understood that some fires, once lit properly, simply refused to go out. Spring came slowly to Elk Ridge that year, the snow retreating in patches up the mountainside, and Holt Auto Repair grew a second bay, then a second mechanic, a quiet, capable young man named Pete Larkin, who Wesley trusted more each week. Pete had walked in that March asking for any work at all, admitting flatly that he'd just gotten out of a rough stretch and that most shops in the county wouldn't even look at his application once they saw the gap in his work history. Wesley remembered exactly what it felt like to be judged for the worst chapter of his life instead of the ones that came after, and he handed Pete a set of keys before the kid had even finished his sentence. "You didn't have to do that," Corinne told him one evening, watching Pete carefully torque a set of lug nuts under the shop lights. "Half your equipment budget went to that hire instead of the new lift you actually needed." Wesley shrugged, not looking up from his own work. "Somebody gave me a shot when I didn't have much to show for myself either," he said, "and I figure that's the only kind of interest that's actually worth paying back." Corinne didn't say anything else, but the look on her face told him she understood exactly what kind of man she'd chosen and exactly why. Corinne split her time between Denver board meetings, now conducted under considerably calmer leadership, and long weekends in the mountains, where Natalie visited often enough that the little apartment above the shop started to feel less like a bachelor's afterthought and more like an actual home. On the anniversary of the storm that had brought them together, Wesley closed the shop early and drove Corinne up to the exact bend in Route 9, where her car had first lost control, the guardrail long since repaired, the trees standing quiet and unbothered in the golden late afternoon light. He parked at the shoulder, and they stood there a while without speaking, watching the valley below fill slowly with shadow. The same road that had once nearly taken everything from her now, looking almost gentle under the softening winter sky. "I used to think that accident was the worst luck of my life," Corinne told him, watching the first light snow of the season begin to drift down around them. "But I think, if I'm honest, it might have been the best thing that ever happened to me." Wesley turned to look at her, snow catching in her hair the way it always seemed to when the moments between them mattered most, and told her that he used to think quitting his old job was the most reckless decision he'd ever made, right up until the night a stranger knocked on his door and turned out to be the answer to every question he hadn't known he was asking. Wesley reached for her hand, snow settling on both their shoulders, and thought about how strange it was that a scream, a screech of tires, and a knock on a stranger's door could end up rewriting an entire life. If you've ever wondered whether the worst night of your year might secretly be leading you somewhere better, We'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if this one moved you even half as much as it moved me writing it, don't forget to subscribe here on Winter Veil so you never miss the next story about the nights that change everything.